You have no voice here, Christine. This is a business meeting, not a housewives' club, Richard said with a dismissive wave of his hand, not even bothering to look at me as he addressed the boardroom. James, control your wife or send her home. My husband James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent. I could see his fingers tightening around his pen, the only sign that he had even heard the insult directed at me. The other board members avoided eye contact, some nervously shuffling papers, others suddenly finding the skyline view fascinating. This wasn't the first time Richard had undermined me in front of the board. As the chief financial officer and a 15% stakeholder in Meridian Technologies, I had every right to question the suspicious transactions that had been appearing in our quarterly reports. But Richard, as the CEO and my husband's longtime friend, had made it his mission to silence me at every turn. Actually, Richard, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, as CFO, it's literally my job to question financial irregularities. These offshore transfers— Oh, for God's sake, Richard interrupted, slamming his palm on the mahogany table. James, I've had enough of this. Your wife is becoming a liability to this company. Either she stops with these baseless accusations, or we'll need to reconsider her position. The threat hung in the air. I looked at James, hoping, praying he would finally stand up for me, for us, for the company we had built together from the ground up. 10 years of marriage and 15 years of friendship before that surely counted for something. James cleared his throat. Richard, Christine is just doing her job, but perhaps we could table this discussion for a private meeting later. No, I cut in. This needs to be addressed now in front of the board. There's been over 40 million in unaccounted transfers to shell companies in the Cayman Islands over the past 6 months. As CFO, I can't sign off on our next quarterly report until— The heavy double doors to the boardroom burst open with such force that the handles left dents in the wall. 6 men and women in dark suits flooded into the room, badges held high. FBI, nobody move, shouted the lead agent, a tall woman with her hair pulled back in a severe bun. Richard Winters, you're under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The room erupted into chaos. Board members half rose from their chairs, faces painted with shock. My assistant Angela, who had been quietly taking minutes in the corner, knocked over her water glass. The sound of it shattering seemed to punctuate the moment, like an exclamation mark on the end of Richard's career. But what struck me most was Richard's face. There was no surprise there, only cold, calculated fury. And it was directed straight at me. You, he hissed as 2 agents pulled his arms behind his back. You did this! James looked between Richard and me, confusion and horror dawning on his face. Christine, what's happening? I couldn't answer him. My throat had closed up as I watched the FBI agents handcuff Richard and recite his Miranda rights. This wasn't how I had planned for things to unfold. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Richard would come clean when confronted with the evidence, that we could handle this internally, salvage what was left of the company. Mrs. Parker, the female agent approached me after securing Richard. I'm Special Agent Rossi. Thank you for your cooperation. We'll need you to come down to the field office to give your statement. James's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide. Your cooperation? Christine, what have you done? The hurt in his voice was like a knife to my chest. But I squared my shoulders and met his gaze. What you wouldn't do, James. I protected our company. As the agents led Richard out, he stopped beside James. Your wife has been working with the feds for months, James. She's been wearing a wire. Ask her how long she's been planning to destroy everything we built. James's face drained of color. The betrayal in his eyes cut deeper than any of Richard's insults ever had. Is that true? He whispered. I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. Yes, but it's not what you think. All board members will need to stay for questioning, Agent Rossi announced. Mr. Parker, we'll need to speak with you as well. As the remaining agents began securing the room and collecting devices, James stared at me like I was a stranger. The weight of what I'd done and what was still to come settled on my shoulders. Richard wasn't the only one who'd been hiding things. "James," I said quietly, "there's something else you need to know." 6 months earlier, I had been working late at the office, reviewing financial reports that didn't add up. The discrepancies had started small, a few thousand here, 100,000 there, but over time they had grown. By my calculations, over $10 million had disappeared into accounts I couldn't trace. When I finally made my way home at nearly midnight, I expected to find James asleep. Instead, I heard his voice coming from his home office, tense and hushed. "Richard, you promised this would be clean. No one would ever know." "Yes, I understand the risks, but no, Christine doesn't suspect anything. She trusts me completely." I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. What was my husband hiding from me? "Fine," James continued. "One more transfer, but that's it. I'm out after this. I never signed up for—" "Yes, I know what happens if I walk away. You don't need to remind me." When he hung up, I silently retreated to the kitchen, making enough noise to announce my arrival. James appeared moments later, his face a perfect mask of normalcy, as he kissed my cheek and asked about my day. That night, I lay awake beside him, watching the ceiling fan spin in endless circles, much like my thoughts. The man sleeping next to me, the man I had loved for over a decade, was a stranger, and I had a sickening feeling that whatever he and Richard were involved in could destroy everything we had built. The next morning, I called in sick, something I never did, and spent the day going through every financial record I could access from home. By evening, I had found enough to know that Richard was siphoning company funds through a complex network of shell corporations. What I couldn't determine was James's role in it all. Was he a willing participant, a victim of blackmail, or was he just an unwitting pawn in Richard's scheme? 3 days later, I received an unmarked envelope at my office. Inside was a USB drive containing transaction records that I hadn't been able to access, records that definitively linked Richard to the missing funds. A note accompanied it. "Not everyone at Meridian is corrupt. Some of us still believe in doing the right thing." I never discovered who my anonymous ally was, but their evidence gave me what I needed to take the next step. That afternoon, I contacted the FBI. Agent Rossi had been skeptical at first. "Mrs. Parker, you understand what you're saying? You're accusing the CEO of a publicly traded company of massive fraud. This will have serious repercussions for everyone involved, including your husband." "I understand," I had replied, my voice steadier than my hands. "But I need to know if my husband is involved, and if he is, I need to know how deep." The investigation moved quickly after that. I became the FBI's confidential informant, wearing a wire to meetings, copying files, recording conversations. Each day was agony. Living a double life, smiling at Richard, knowing he was a criminal, lying next to James each night wondering if he was one too. What made it worse was that I never caught James in anything explicitly illegal. There were conversations with Richard that skirted the edge of impropriety, references to transactions that made me uncomfortable, but nothing concrete. Nothing that proved he was knowingly participating in Richard's scheme until 2 weeks ago. I had been reviewing the latest batch of suspicious transfers when I noticed something different. The money wasn't just flowing out to anonymous shell companies anymore. Some of it was flowing back in, disguised as legitimate investment returns. And the paperwork authorizing these transactions bore my husband's signature. That night, I confronted James in our kitchen. "What do you know about the Cayman transfers?" I asked, keeping my voice casual as I chopped vegetables for dinner. James barely looked up from his phone. "Not much. Richard handles most of the international investments. But you've signed off on them." His knife paused over the cutting board. Some of them, probably. Richard brings me a lot of paperwork. You know how it is. So you don't review what you're signing? James set down his knife and looked at me, his expression guarded. What's this about, Christine? It's about $40 million, James. It's about the fact that our company is hemorrhaging money into accounts that shouldn't exist. You're overreacting, he said, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Richard knows what he's doing. The international tax structure is complicated. This isn't about taxes, I interrupted. This is about fraud, and your signature is all over it. James's face hardened. Drop it, Christine. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm the CFO. It's literally my job to know. Well, maybe you should focus more on being a supportive wife and less on trying to undermine your husband's business partner. His words hit me like a slap. In all our years together, James had never spoken to me that way. Is that what Richard tells you? I asked quietly. That I'm not supportive? That I'm undermining him? James ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. You've been obsessed with finding problems where there aren't any. Richard built this company from nothing. He gave us both opportunities we'd never have had otherwise. A little gratitude wouldn't kill you. Gratitude? I echoed in disbelief. For what? For stealing from our company? For putting everything we've worked for at risk? You don't understand the pressure he's under, the commitments he's had to make to keep us competitive. Sometimes business requires flexibility. Flexibility? I repeated. Is that what we're calling federal crimes now? This conversation is over, James snapped, throwing down his kitchen towel. I'm going out. As the front door slammed behind him, I leaned against the counter, feeling sick. My husband wasn't just aware of the fraud, he was justifying it, defending Richard, choosing him over me, over the law, over everything we had built together. That night, I made my decision. I contacted Agent Rossi and told her I was ready to go on record. The FBI would move on Richard at the next board meeting, where I knew he would try once again to silence me when I brought up the suspicious transfers. What I hadn't told them was that I had discovered one more thing, a separate account, hidden even deeper than the others, with regular payments going to James. Payments that had started 3 years ago, right around the time we had started trying to have a baby, only to discover that James had a medical condition requiring expensive treatments not covered by insurance. The truth hit me like a thunderbolt. My husband had sold his integrity for our future family, and now I had to decide whether to protect him or let him fall with Richard. What else could there possibly be, Christine? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boardroom had emptied except for us and 2 FBI agents standing discreetly by the door. I took a deep breath. The Cayman accounts weren't Richard's only secret. There's another account in Singapore. Monthly payments have been going into it for 3 years. I paused, watching his face. Payments to you, James? The color drained from his face. How did you? It doesn't matter. What matters is why. Why would you risk everything, our company, our reputation, our future, for whatever Richard was offering? James slumped into his chair, suddenly looking 10 years older. It wasn't what you think. I never meant for any of this to happen. Then explain it to me, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Make me understand why my husband became a criminal. He glanced at the FBI agents, then back at me. Not here. Mr. Parker, Agent Rossi interjected, approaching our table. I'm afraid we need to continue this conversation at our field office, both of you. The ride to the FBI office was silent. James stared out the window, his reflection in the glass showing a man I barely recognized, hollowed out, haunted. I wanted to reach for his hand, to offer some comfort, but the gulf between us felt unbridgeable. At the field office, we were separated. I spent hours recounting everything I knew about Richard's schemes, providing access to files, explaining financial discrepancies. When I finally asked about James, Agent Rossi's face softened slightly. "Your husband is cooperating. That's all I can tell you for now." It was nearly midnight when they finished with me. As I gathered my belongings, exhaustion weighing on me like a physical burden, the door opened and James appeared, escorted by another agent. "Mrs. Parker," Agent Rossi said, "your husband has been very forthcoming. Based on his cooperation and the evidence provided, we believe he may have been operating under duress. We still have more questions, but you're both free to go home tonight. Don't leave town." In the taxi home, the silence between us felt like a third passenger. It wasn't until we were inside our house, the door locked behind us, that James finally spoke. 3 years ago, Richard came to me with what seemed like a straightforward proposal. Meridian was struggling with cash flow after that failed expansion into Europe. He said he had investors willing to inject capital through private channels. It would mean bypassing some regulatory hurdles, but it would save the company. James moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a whiskey with shaking hands. He didn't offer me one. I told him no at first. It sounded too risky, too grey area. But then, his voice caught. Then we found out about my condition. The treatments weren't covered by insurance. They would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of success. And you wanted a baby so badly, Christine. My heart constricted painfully in my chest. So you agreed to Richard's scheme, for me, for a baby. I told myself it was just temporary, just until the company recovered, until we had our family started. Richard offered me a separate compensation package, off the books, said it was for the extra risk I was taking. "The Singapore account," I whispered. James nodded miserably. But once I was in, there was no getting out. Richard kept moving the goalposts. Each quarter there was a new crisis, a new reason why we had to continue the arrangement. And then he started getting careless, taking more than we'd agreed to. When I confronted him, he reminded me that my signature was on everything. I'd go down with him if it all came to light. "So you were trapped," I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "But why didn't you come to me? We could have faced it together." "How could I tell you?" James's voice cracked. "How could I admit that I'd betrayed everything we stood for? That I'd compromised our company, our future? That the treatments, the doctors, everything was paid for with dirty money?" "The treatments didn't even work," I said softly. The irony was almost too much to bear. All this risk, all this deception, and we still didn't have the child we'd hoped for. "No, they didn't," James agreed, his eyes filling with tears. "And by then, Richard had evidence that could send me to prison. He had recordings, documents, insurance, he called it. Every time I tried to back away, he'd remind me of what he could do to us." I crossed the kitchen and took the glass from his hand, setting it on the counter. "James, look at me. Why didn't you tell me this when I confronted you 2 weeks ago? Why defend Richard?" "Because I was scared," he admitted, finally meeting my eyes. "Scared of losing you, scared of prison. Richard convinced me you were getting too close, that you'd uncover everything. He said if I could just keep you distracted long enough, he'd clean everything up, make the evidence against me disappear." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to," James said simply. "It was easier than facing the truth." I took his hands in mine, feeling the familiar callus on his right thumb, a small human detail that reminded me this was still James, still the man I'd loved for so long. "What did you tell the FBI tonight?" "Everything. Every transaction. Every meeting. Every threat. I showed them the recordings I secretly made of Richard threatening me. I was too afraid to use them before, but once you wore that wire, I knew it was over. I had to choose a side." "And you chose me," I said, a statement, not a question. James squeezed my hands, too late probably. But yes, I chose you. I chose us. We stayed like that for a long moment, the weight of secrets finally lifted, the damage they had caused still to be measured. What happens now? I finally asked. Agent Rossi thinks I'll likely face charges, but with my cooperation and the evidence of coercion, she believes a deal can be worked out. Probation, perhaps. Maybe some time served. He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The company, though, Meridian won't survive this. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead, but I knew he was right. Once news of the fraud broke, our stock would plummet. Clients would flee. The company we'd built over 15 years would crumble in 15 days. We'll figure it out, I said with more confidence than I felt. One day at a time. James pulled me into his arms, and I let him, though part of me remained guarded. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight, but standing there in our kitchen, I made a silent promise to try, to find a path forward, whatever that might look like. What I didn't tell him was that Agent Rossi had made me an offer of my own, one that could change everything if I was brave enough to accept it. The next morning broke with the harsh light of reality. Our phones buzzed incessantly with messages from board members, executives, and employees, all demanding explanations we weren't authorized to give. By noon, news of Richard's arrest had leaked to the financial press. By 1, Meridian's stock had been halted after falling 60%. James and I sat at our dining table, watching our professional lives unravel in real time on our laptops. 15 years, James murmured, staring at the plunging stock chart. Gone in a day. I reached across the table and closed his laptop. Not gone, changed. There's a difference. He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. How can you be so calm? We're about to lose everything. No, I said firmly, we're about to lose some things. Important things, yes, but not everything. My phone rang. Agent Rossi. I answered and put it on speaker. Mrs. Parker, we need your decision by 3 o'clock today. James frowned, looking between me and the phone. Decision about what? I took a deep breath. About the company, about our future. Agent Rossi continued, the U.S. attorney is willing to consider the proposal, but only with your full cooperation and only if we move quickly before the market completely loses confidence. I'll do it, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Send me the paperwork. After I hung up, James stared at me in confusion. What was that about? What proposal? Last night, after they finished questioning me, Agent Rossi mentioned that in cases like this, where a company has been corrupted by specific executives, but the underlying business is sound, there are options besides letting it collapse. What kind of options? A negotiated resolution. The company admits wrongdoing, pays significant penalties, and agrees to strict oversight. But in exchange, it's allowed to continue operating under new leadership. Understanding dawned on James's face. And you would be that new leadership, I nodded. As acting CEO, at least initially. The board would be reconstituted with independent directors. Richard's assets would be seized, his shares placed in a trust. And you would step aside, he finished for me, permanently. It's the only way to save the company, James. To save the jobs of 800 people who did nothing wrong. To salvage something from this mess. He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands on the table. And you're willing to do this? To take on that responsibility, knowing what you'll face? The scrutiny, the skepticism, the sheer weight of it all? I am, I said simply. Why? He asked, looking up at me. After everything that's happened, all the lies, all the betrayal, why would you fight to save Meridian? I considered my answer carefully. Because Meridian isn't Richard. It isn't even us. It's the engineers who've poured their creativity into our products. It's the sales team that believes in what we do. It's the administrative staff who keep everything running smoothly. They deserve a chance. And honestly, so do I. James reached across the table and took my hand. You'll be amazing. You always have been the strongest person I've ever known. I don't feel strong, I admitted. I feel terrified. But I've spent too many years being silenced by Richard, by my own fears, even sometimes by you. I'm done with that. And us? James asked quietly. Is there still an us in this new future you're building? It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I still didn't have a clear answer to. I don't know, I said honestly. I love you, James. That hasn't changed. But trust. Trust is harder to rebuild than a company. He nodded, accepting this truth with a sad smile. I'll do whatever it takes, however long it takes. Start by telling the truth, I said. To the FBI, to the prosecutors, to me. No more secrets, no more justifications, just the truth, however painful. I promise, he said. And for the first time in months, I believed him. The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, employee town halls, and marathon sessions with the board. James, true to his word, cooperated fully with the investigation. Richard, meanwhile, maintained his innocence, though the evidence against him mounted daily. As expected, James was charged, but with significantly reduced counts that reflected his cooperation and the coercion he had faced. The deal Agent Rossi had predicted came through. 3 years probation, community service, and a lifetime ban from serving as an officer in a publicly traded company. It was punishment, certainly, but not the destruction I had feared. On a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after the FBI had burst into our boardroom, I stood before Meridian's employees in our largest conference room. The room was overflowing, with people lining the walls and crowding the doorway. Today marks a new beginning for Meridian Technologies, I began, my voice carrying across the hushed room. The past month has been painful for all of us. We've lost colleagues, we've faced public scrutiny, our very survival has been questioned. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some hopeful, some skeptical, all attentive. But we're still here, and we're going to do more than just survive. We're going to rebuild, stronger and more ethical than before. The Department of Justice has accepted our corporate resolution. The new board has approved our restructuring plan, and our core clients have expressed their continued support. A tentative ripple of applause began, growing stronger as it spread through the room. It won't be easy, I continued when the room quieted again. We have strict compliance obligations. We've lost some of our financial flexibility. We'll need to work harder than ever to regain the market's trust. But I believe in what we've built here. Not the shell game that Richard Winters ran, but the real innovation, the real products, the real people who make Meridian what it is. I spotted James at the back of the room. He hadn't wanted to come, feeling his presence might undermine the fresh start, but I had insisted. Whatever his mistakes, he was part of this story too. In the coming days, each department will meet with their new leadership to discuss our path forward. But today, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. At the new Meridian, every voice will be heard. Every concern will be addressed. No one will ever again be told they have no voice in this company's future. So the room erupted in applause and cheers. As I stepped away from the podium, my assistant handed me a small envelope that had just been delivered. Inside was a handwritten note. I always knew you had the strongest voice in the room. Proud of you. Love, Jay. I glanced toward the back of the room, but James was gone. That evening, I returned to an empty house. James had moved out 2 weeks earlier. His decision, not mine. You need space to become the leader you're meant to be, he'd said. And I need time to become the man I should have been all along. I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of wine, taking it out to the back porch where we used to sit together on summer evenings. The future stretched before me, uncertain but full of possibility. Meridian would survive. Whether my marriage would do the same remained to be seen. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Saw you on CNBC today. The whole business world is talking about the woman who saved Meridian from itself. Dinner. Friday. No pressure, just two old friends catching up. I smiled, typing back, 7 o'clock. I'll make reservations. Perhaps trust, like a company, could be rebuilt. One honest conversation at a time. Either way, I had found my voice, and I wasn't about to be silenced again. As I sat there watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of possibility, I thought about Richard, now facing years in prison, and the irony of his dismissive words that day in the boardroom. He had been right about one thing. I hadn't had a voice then, not the one I needed, but I had found it now, and everyone was listening,